Thank you, Sig, for those generous introductions. The Pulitzer's highest honor this year went to a story that many Floridians had suspected all along, that off-duty police officers are the worst speeders on the road. Until the Sentinel followed the digital footprint left by speeding cops, the evidence had been largely, purely anecdotal. But the reporters got the records that provided clear, unimpeachable proof that off-duty policemen were racing at high speeds through tollways, endangering not only themselves, but also other motorists. The key to unlocking this story were highway toll records. In the course of a 3-month investigation, reporter Sally Kestin and database specialist John Maines mined Sun-Pass toll records from 12 South Florida police agencies. They found nearly 800 cops who reached speeds of 90 to 130 miles per hour in the previous year, many of them driving while off-duty. Their research showed that speeding cops had caused at least 320 crashes since 2004, killing or maiming 21 people. The victims included a 14-year-old girl and a college student. Yet Sun Sentinel's investigation revealed that only one speeding cop went to jail, and only for 60 days. We're going to show you a video that explains the seriousness of the problem and its tragic consequences.
We expect police officers and deputies to come rushing during emergencies, but what about when there's no emergency? South Florida law enforcement officers are sworn to uphold traffic laws on our roadways, but they're among the worst speeding offenders a Sun Sentinel investigation has found. Oftentimes, the speeding ends with fatal results.
This was a tragic accident. I know what I did was wrong. I know I was driving faster than the speed limit on that night.
The Sun Sentinel has learned that more than 700 cops from a dozen agencies hit speeds of 90 to 130 miles an hour through South Florida highways from October of 2010 through November of 2011. Miami police officers were among the most chronic off-duty speeders, with 143 cops driving at least 90 miles an hour, all of them outside city limits. More than 50 exceeded 100 miles an hour. When shown the records, even Miami police officials seemed surprised by the numbers the Sun Sentinel uncovered.
Can I get a copy of this? Because this,
yeah,
of course,
we're going to leave this
beautiful,
with you.
beautiful. Thank you. Wait, all of those drivers?
Yeah.
Wow. It's not very prudent to be out violating the very laws that we enforce. This is something for our internal affairs major to receive and investigate, because, you know, again, the policy is what the policy is, and the policy says that they will adhere to the laws, rules, and regulations, and the departmental orders, and you know, anytime we find that someone's not doing that, then they'll have to deal with the consequences that come with that.
The problem with speeding cops caught national attention in October when a state trooper clocked Miami police officer Fausto Lopez going 120 miles an hour on Florida's Turnpike on his way to a second job.
Reporting this story was not easy. State toll operators initially refused to provide the data. They ultimately released 1.1 million tollway transactions. Using these records, as well as other creative methods that we'll talk about shortly, Sally and John created an interactive database of 800 speeding cops and all the trips that they took where they exceeded the speed limit. The series generated overwhelming reader response and set a record for online page views. Some readers even submitted their own videos of speeding policemen. The series also produced immediate results. 163 officers have since been disciplined. 1 Miami cop was fired, 10 others were suspended. Some changes were systemic. Police departments began monitoring officers driving using GPSs and other devices. Another department used the same methods employed by the Sun Sentinel. They checked the officers' toll records. Best of all, South Florida cops have since slowed down. In a follow-up story, the Sun Sentinel examined a new set of toll records and found an 84% drop in excessive speeding. As one reader wrote to the paper, "Thank you for making the roads safer and forcing these guys to slow down." Sally, We have 200 students here who are about to start working on their master's projects, and they are looking for story ideas. Where did the idea for this story come from?
The officer at the very end of that video, the one who saw nothing wrong with driving 120 miles an hour in pre-rush hour traffic, by the way, simply because he was running late to his second job as a private security guard. He was the impetus for our investigation. The state trooper who pulled him over, and that was by the way, very unusual occurrence in Florida. They would give a pass, essentially, to any law enforcement officers as soon as they recognized the vehicle. But she didn't. She had seen this guy flying up and down the highway before, and she pulled him over. She chased him for 7 minutes with her lights on before he finally pulled over. And her dashboard camera caught the whole thing. And you see him just zipping in and out of 5 lanes of traffic. She's going, over 100. She can't quite catch him. And the video of that traffic stop went viral, and as you might imagine, and the stories in South Florida about it just drew hundreds of comments. Most of them, people outraged at the hypocrisy of police officers who, including him, who write speeding tickets for a living, so blatantly disregarding the laws that they enforce. So John and I were both on the investigations team, and we actually had, for a couple of years before that, we had gone through some staff cuts, and we weren't really doing the long-term investigations that we had once done, and we got a new editor, and he was very interested and committed to doing investigative journalism. And we just happened to be looking for ideas right at that time. So I went to John and said, we know this guy is not the only cop out there doing this because we've seen it ourselves. And here's the perfect opportunity to try to tackle this. And then the question just became, well, how are we going to prove it?
So this was one case, right? And many of our stories start with one case or several cases. We start with anecdotes. But how do you go beyond the anecdote? How do you report a story that goes beyond individual cases to show that there's really a pattern of wrongdoing?
Well, we needed to have some kind of a solid base of evidence. And we had discussions about we had to have something very good and strong. And Sally and I had talked about how we're going to prove this. And one of the things we first thought about was GPS. We'll get the GPS from the police departments. That didn't work. The police departments either surprisingly didn't have GPS, or they just told us, forget it. You can't have it because you'll identify where our cops lived, and some of them are undercover officers, and you can't have it. So eventually we came across the thought, well, there was one embarrassing thing we did, which we went out and bought a radar gun. And don't ever try that. It doesn't work. We were at an overpass at 5 o'clock in the morning trying to shoot down at these cars, and it's dark, and you can't see anything. You can't see if it's a cop car or not. What you can see in the background is a big cloud of rain coming right at you, and we hadn't brought our raincoats or umbrellas. So we finally decided that the idea of what we had to do was get these SunPass records, these toll, like Easy Pass here, same exact thing. And so we went out and we requested the records. At first the agency said, no, you can't have them because it's private information. We looked at the law and they said the law says you can't have personal and confidential information released. There was none of that. These transponders were that the cop cars carry, which take a reading whenever they go through a gantry, were public. They belonged to a public agency, public agencies. So that's where we went at from there.
So did you have to file a lawsuit to get those records, or you just?
No, we already did it ourselves. We didn't even have to get our attorneys involved. We just, as kind of a standard practice, whenever we hit a roadblock on records, we say, well, show us the specific statute that you think allows you to withhold this information. And they sent it to us. And we looked at it, and clearly it was the law that is intended to protect your credit card information when you give them credit cards to pay for your tolls. And we just wrote back, very very short response, actually, but said, this has nothing to do with what we're requesting. And they, after about 3 or 4 days, said, yeah, you're right. And they said it is a public record. We've never been asked for this before, but it's public. And unbeknownst to us at the time, we were actually still getting some resistance within SunPass. We learned this later because I started getting anonymous emails from someone who signed them just the Owl. And it was clearly somebody within SunPass who wanted us to kind of figured out why we wanted these records and was eager to help. And one of his first emails was, I'm happy to help you, but you can't reveal who I am. And I just wrote back and I said, I don't even know who you are. And that worked, got a little dialogue going, and we found out from this source that there was a new director at the toll agency. We never actually talked to her, but this is what we were told later, who had come from New Jersey and wasn't very media friendly and was not too keen on the idea of giving us this data. And there was some meeting coming up that she had called with their general counsel, presumably to try to block the release of it. And this helpful employee had enough clout there that he actually instructed a subordinate to go into the office on a weekend and download or upload the data to an FTP site for us to access. So the Owl was very helpful. He only lasted about a month and then flew the coop, and we never heard from him again.
But the tollway data didn't tell the entire story, right? Because they just showed the time the police car entered the tollway and the time it left. You had to, how do you prove?
Actually, it only told you that it went through a gantry, not the time that it left. It only said that this cop car went, and you used the transponder number. Show this. You want to show that? Okay. So there it is. That's what it looks. That's exactly the raw data we got for City of Miami. And if you look at it, it doesn't show when they started, when they entered, how, and mostly it doesn't tell you what the distance was. And that was, in computer work, you want to have everything in rows and columns and have a nice, neat, here's where you started on your trip to work, and here's where you got out. You went through the gantry to go, but this doesn't do it for you. And also what it doesn't do is it doesn't have mileage. So right away we knew we had a problem. We called the state and said, can you give us the mileage between these toll gantries? And they said, well, we can give you the mileage mile marker, which just this mile marker 13, mile marker 18. We knew that wasn't good enough because this information, we had to have it very, very accurate. So after wondering how to do that for a little while, we called Garmin. Sally called Garmin, the GPS manufacturer. And Garmin said, we've got just the thing for you. It's a little thing about the size of a matchbox, and it's extremely accurate. It's runners and bicyclists use it for timing themselves. And so we got that, $140 or something like that. And so we set out to drive, ultimately ended up like 2,500 miles that we drove going gantry to gantry in the dead of night and collecting all this data for mileage. So then once we had that, it was simple math, really.
How long did that take? Just the two of you collecting for each gantry the mileage record?
It turned out to be a lot more time-consuming than we initially envisioned, partly because it was impossible to not get run over by another aggressive South Florida driver and do it yourself, because you had to slow down enough to mark the exact spot underneath the toll gantry. And it was too much to do for one person, so it was a two-person job. One person drove, and the other one would mark the beginning of the route and the end of the route with the GPS and record the mileage. So that ate up a lot of time, and it took us probably about 6 weeks, I guess. We, at one point, recruited an editorial assistant in the newsroom to be our driver. The other thing we realized was it wasn't good enough to just go one direction. From one toll booth to the next, you could not assume it was the same distance in the opposite direction. And a lot of that had to do with exit ramps. You might enter with just a straight shot onto the highway, or you might go through a loop, and that really affects the distance. So we had to measure each way, both ways, And we got reimbursed for, I think, 2,500 miles driven on our cars.
So finding the evidence of the speeding was one part of the story. The other part was finding evidence of the damage the speeding had caused. How did you go about doing that?
Well, Sally's great about every time she does a story, she wants to say, okay, we've proved wrongdoing, but who are the victims? Who are the victims here? And so what she basically set out to do was basically find out people who had been killed by cops going at high rates of speed. And it happens to turn out that there's quite a few of them. And not only that, but sometimes the cops kill themselves.
How did you find these people, Sally?
A combination of just searching, actually Google searching for certain ones around Florida that had gotten media coverage, but we wanted to do something more comprehensive than that. And for years, John and our data folks had collected Florida highway safety motor vehicle crash records. So we had but about, I think, the last 2 years worth. So we ordered those from the state. And then we were able to just search. I think we ended up searching about 1.7 million crashes, looking for any that involved police officers and when those vehicles were cited for, or when excessive speed was a factor. So that's how we were able to find the 320. And then the deaths and it really just helped convey the danger that this posed and the just tragic consequences.
So one of the most immersive things about this story is your database. You built a searchable database. Can you show us how you went from this to the actual database?
Basically, I won't go into the details, but there was problems with actually building the data to get the accurate readings, because the way we had to put the data together, we got many, many false readings. And it ballooned up from 1 million to 4 million records. And there was nothing we could do about that. We just had to figure out a way to fix it so that we got really true and accurate numbers. And that's what it looks like in the end. And you can see now the Plaza 1, Plaza 2, that's the start and the stop, and then the distance, and then the speed calculation.
So you had 4 million records like this?
It ended up basically, when I say false reading, sort of like a house of mirrors. When you go in and there's all these mirrors, which is the real person, which is the real number. Yeah. That's how it ballooned up to 4 million. And
this is how it looked like on the website? This
is something we always do these days. This is a searchable database that the user can use. It's really no good for me. For my analysis, I'm using Microsoft Access and SQL Server, for those that you know that, and Excel. But we always want to build something that people can go to our website and play with, basically. And so this is that, where you could plug in a police station agency or a county, or even you could type in a transponder number. And the site got a lot of traffic, and we think it was probably cops looking at their fellow cops.
Because the transponder doesn't actually identify the cop, right?
No, and one thing we initially thought we'd get the names of all the cops. That proved too difficult, really. We knew the one speeder, the guy that started the whole project. We were able to identify him pretty quickly. But when we went to the agencies and started saying, can you give us all the names, who's got that transponder, we were running into too much difficulty, and in the end, it really didn't matter. We really had the one guy, and so it wasn't worth spending more months just suing to get that data.
Okay, your turn to ask questions. We have microphones on this side of the aisles, so please come up. Right. Just say your name quickly and...
My name is Roger Miller, and I was wondering if you've seen other news agencies try to repeat your study using the same techniques, and how you feel about that.
We have been contacted by a few. I know in Florida, SunPass now is not releasing the data, or they were giving other reporters problems with it. And we live in a state with great public access, public records laws. So, I think that would be an obstacle for reporters in other states, might not be able to get the data at all. But I think it's a wonderful idea. Anybody that can, I'm certain this problem is happening in a lot of communities. It's not just a uniquely South Florida problem, so I think any other kinds of stories would be great.
Hi, my name is Daniel Dwapper. How many clicks did your database really had? Because you didn't have the names of the cops. How much interest did that generate?
The web page that you're looking?
Just the database.
Yeah, I can't remember the raw numbers of how many hits we got, but we got lots. Over time, thousands of hits, which for the New York Times isn't a lot. They count them by the millions, but for us it was a lot.
Yes, please.
Hi, two questions. One, when you brought this information to police, I guess we saw the video, but was that seemed very positive? Was that actually how they responded beyond the video? But two, what did they do to actually fix the problems? You said there was a follow-up article. The speeding had gone down dramatically. What was the solution?
Yeah, we made a decision to take what we had found to the police agencies really earlier than we normally would in an investigation. We went about a month, maybe 5 weeks in some cases, and we also made a decision to give them the data because we really wanted to vet this. We wanted to know ahead of time if they were going to raise any significant challenges to it. And we weren't exactly sure what to expect when we went in, but it was surprising to us. Every single department opened an internal affairs investigation based on what we hand-delivered to them ahead of the publication. And they all took it very seriously. It's a liability for a police chief or police administrators to have their guys out there, especially off-duty, with no legitimate reason to be speeding and crash into somebody. It's a liability. So they were, they were very receptive. They did different things. I think the biggest change was cultural. It's not that they didn't know this was happening before. It's just we presented such irrefutable evidence of it on such a big scale that it just became impossible for them to ignore anymore. And I really saw a change. Before where somebody would call and report a cop for going 100 miles an hour, they'd say, bad cop, and maybe write up something in their personnel file, and that was it. And they started taking it seriously. One department actually modified a feature in the GPS in their police cars so that this annoying computer voice, a woman's voice now comes on whenever they exceed the speed limit, and she says, "You are speeding." So I'm sure they're very thankful to us for that.
They should have used your voice, probably. Yes, please.
Hi, my name's Jenny. I guess I'm just still a little unclear. So you've uncovered all this data, and then you take it to the police departments and the highway patrol. But what was the step that you were able to verify the number of these cases weren't actually en route to an actual emergency? And what was the percentage of those findings?
We couldn't say definitively. The way we characterized it in the story was over half of all of those speeding incidents occurred outside the jurisdiction of the agency where the officer was working. And they were, pretty clear patterns. It was somebody kind of going back and forth the same route day in, day out. So it appeared it was people commuting, going back and forth to work. They weren't in their city limits, so they really didn't have a justifiable reason to be going those speeds. There were certain countywide agencies in the Florida Highway Patrol where we couldn't tell because their jurisdictions are much larger. And we didn't say one way or the other if that was off-duty. We just said many of them appear, or most of them appear to be off-duty because they're outside their cities. And then when the internal affairs investigations came back, after we had published, they did verify that they were off-duty.
Yes?
Hi. I was curious at what point in the reporting process you knew that this was a big story, because it obviously took a lot of time and effort to nail it down. And second, I was curious about your decision to go to Garmin. Were there any concerns in going to a private company with your scoop and what you were trying to find?
Second question first. The reason we went to Garmin was we actually tried driving it just in measuring distances with our odometers, and that's what we were originally going to go with. And we went out in my car a couple of times, and then we went out in John's car once, and we happened to measure the same one, and we got a different answer. And then we realized, odometers just aren't as precise as we need them to be, because we had certain toll booths that were only, a couple of miles apart or even less than that. So if you're off by 1/10 of a mile, that really affects the speed. So then we went to an engineer and we said, this is our problem, what would you do? And they said, well, GPS is the way to go. That's going to get you the kind of precision and accuracy that you need. So then it just became, I didn't have any concerns about the private company. We just wanted to know what would be the best model to achieve what we were trying to. And I'm sorry, what was your first question?
Just when in the reporting process you knew?
Our eureka moment, we had a few of those. Probably, we started calculating the speeds. We didn't wait until we had measured everything. We did it we would come back after a day of driving around, and John would plug a few of those distances in. And we started with the ones the routes that were the most traveled, so we'd get, the biggest volume, the biggest bang for our buck. And we started plugging the distances in, and we started seeing speeds, a lot of speeds like this over. We made a decision later on using 90 as a cutoff, but we were seeing, many, many more in the high 80s. But then we were seeing 90s and 100, and we thought, yeah, we're definitely onto something here.
This would have to be our last question. Yes.
Hi, my name's Thomas. I have a two-part question. They're both based on data. One is, when you were calculating the speeds from sort of one toll plaza to another, did you take into account the deceleration and acceleration that would have to happen? And because that would actually bring the whole speed down. And also, for the Miami Police Department, whenever they were mentioned, it always was mentioned that it was always outside of sort of Miami city boundaries, whereas for other departments it was often outside. So what was the distinction there? Why were the Miami cops always outside?
On the first question, yeah, we calculated average speed. And so if somebody was going 90 miles an hour and our average speed was 90, and they got off at an exit, they were going even faster most of the trip. And what was the second question?
The second question was...
Miami. Yeah, the reason was because all of the toll roads that the Miami cops were riding on, they were all outside the city limits. So if you had any toll transactions for the city of Miami, they were automatically outside the city. Some of the other departments, they were mostly outside the city, but they may have come into the city for some of the time, and so we couldn't say 100% with certainty that those were off duty. So that's why we phrased it that way. There just weren't any toll plazas that we included within the city limits of Miami. Very blatant speeding there.
Thank you for your questions. We'll have more time at the end of all three panels to ask more questions.